I welcome you to our 2020 Kleh International Law Lecture. Today's lecture is made possible by William H. Kleh, a graduate of BU Law from the class of 1971, and by Bill's wife, Patricia Kleh. In 2011, they made a generous gift to establish the William and Patricia Kleh Visiting Professorship in International Law and to support this lecture series. International law is a critical subject for any aspiring or practicing attorney in the 21st century. And as we look back on 2020, a year that will be reported in the annals of global history like nearly none other, it is perhaps clearer than ever how globalized and intertwined our societies and economies have become. Regardless of the rallying cries for a return to practices of protectionism in many developed nations, I doubt that the trend toward globalization that we've experienced over the past 50 years is going to change. And globalization is not simply about economics. It's about human rights, environmental justice, prosecutorial ethics, and more. And so even if an attorney plans to practice only in the United States, throughout their entire career, knowledge of international law is important to a holistic understanding of the law and to civic engagement in our global community. This is what makes the Kleh Lecture in International Law so important. Since it was first established, we have welcomed legal scholars to BU Law from around the world to discuss tort litigation against state sponsors of terrorism, the legality of torture and enhanced interrogation methods, victims' rights in international criminal law, income inequality, citizenship, and violence against women. We are extremely grateful to the Klehs for providing our students and our entire BU Law community the opportunity to engage with esteemed scholars of international law from around the world. Bill and Patricia are also long-standing supporters of Boston University as a whole. They established in 2001 the annual Kleh Family Foundation Distinguished Lecture, which brings esteemed BU faculty to London to speak on a broad range of topics. And past speakers in the series have included our own Professor Kevin Outerson in 2016 on the global threat of antibiotic resistance. In 2018, Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs and Dean Emerita Maureen O'Rourke on copyright law in the digital age. And way back in 2002, Ronald Cass, then Dean of BU Law, on terrorism, the rule of law, and trade in the recent wake of 9/11. As you can see, William and Patricia Kleh have made a tremendous and lasting impact on academic and intellectual life here at BU Law and across the university, and we're truly grateful for their support. So please join me in welcoming Bill Kleh to make some introductory remarks and to introduce the 2020 William and Patricia Kleh Visiting Professor in International Law, Dr. Eddie Bruce Jones. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Onwuachi-Willig. My wife, Patty, who is here with me today, and I are pleased to be able to continue to help sponsor the Visiting Professorship in International Law. This year's visiting professor is Dr. Eddie Bruce Jones, Professor of Law at Birkbeck College, University of London. Dr. Bruce Jones is our 7th visiting professor of international law, and as in the past, our visiting professor is also lecturing at another of BU's schools, the Pardee School of Global Studies. Today, Dr. Bruce Jones will be giving his inaugural talk, which is titled Contractual Intimacies, British Indentureship from Kolkata to Kingston. Today also marks the first time that I have been asked to give the introduction. I think that this is no coincidence, because it is no coincidence that this is also the first time when we're all meeting virtually. In this format, should I mess up, it is much easier to leave the event by pressing the leave button on one's computer than by standing up and walking out of Barristers Hall in front of everyone else. Actually, I'm quite pleased to have been asked to give this particular introduction. Last week, I met virtually with Dr. Bruce Jones and was not only impressed by the breadth of his knowledge and intellect, but as well by the many subjects of his scholarship and research. I understand that he is teaching 2 courses this fall, Human Rights in Europe and Critical Perspectives on International Law. If this were a normal year and I were present in Boston at this time, I would have wanted to attend one of his classes. Currently, as trustee of the New World Symphony in Miami, I serve on the newly formed Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee, and I also co-chair the Miami Committee of Human Rights Watch. These 2 involvements fall well within the subject matter of Dr. Bruce Jones's work, and I hope in the future to continue a personal dialogue with our speaker today. Dr. Bruce Jones's contributions in his field have overlapped many of the issues now facing our country as it continues to grapple with racial and social injustice. He is a reader, that is, an associate professor in law and anthropology at Birkbeck College, University of London, where he is also deputy dean of the School of Law, which houses law and criminology, and he's also head of the Department of Law. He researches and writes on race, colonialism, asylum, and state violence. He earned his doctorate in anthropology from Humboldt University in Berlin, has law degrees from Columbia University and King's College London, and an undergraduate degree from Harvard. He is the author of the book, Race in the Shadow of Law, State Violence in Contemporary Europe. And he is currently working on his second book, focused on the indentureship period in which South Asians were transported throughout the British Empire. And this is the basis of today's lecture. So without further ado, I turn this over to Dr. Eddie Bruce Jones.
Thank you so much.
You're on.
There we go, unmuted. Thank you, Bill. And thank you, Patricia, for bringing me to Boston this term. Also, thank you to Provost Jean Morrison and Dean Angela Onwachi-Willig for the lovely invitation to join you this semester. It's been a privilege to teach your students and get to know members of staff. Thanks also to Associate Dean Stacy Dogan for looking after me during my stay, and Professor Daniela Caruso for including me in discussions on race at the Pardee Center for the Study of Europe. It's been really a delight to be a part of the BU community. I'm going to share my screen with you. Go. Okay. So for my talk this afternoon, it'll be perhaps a bit different from other lectures on law for 2 reasons. First, law is situated in the text as a feature, but not for its doctrine, but for its institutions, including its administrative machinery and its function of accounting in some way for history. So the talk is in that way interdisciplinary, and law shares the space with literature, history, and theory. In terms of international law, the project itself attempts to bring together the ways that we frame colonialism and the ways that we understand the legal and political interests at stake during the colonial era to examine global forms of exploitation. But again, it's not about the international legal doctrine of the time, but about looking at the circuitry of international laws that governed the indentureship period. Secondly, following from that, the style of my presentation is going to be a bit more narrative, and I'll be reading excerpts from a new book project that I call Kalepani, Law, Imagination, and Colonial Indenture. And the talk has 3 parts: a narrative introduction, and then a bit about the system of indenture itself, and then where I'll look at areas of laws affected by the contracts, and then some reflections on death and the role that death plays in the archive. And so I'll look forward to your questions afterwards. So by the river, there were no people. The city was roaring just beyond the trees, but the silence of the river is patient and holds our focus intently on the shine of the flowing water. This is not what I'm accustomed to after having been in Calcutta for several weeks. I've acclimated to the intimacy of touch, sense memory learned on previous trips to Indian cities, where the need to negotiate the tight spaces between my body and other people's bodies is commonplace. I feel the air moving lightly across the water, vast and anticipatory. Gautam's head is turned away from the Howrah Bridge toward the sea. I must close my eyes and try to imagine the river settled with boats and the many thousands excited and scared. I had not imagined the memorial to indentured laborers would be isolated here on a closed compound. Gautam Chakrabarti, the head of security for the docks, had divulged that soon he planned to retire, and I wondered if he'd been contemplating what his daily routine would be like, absent his fastidious attention of the premises. I almost missed the chance to visit the memorial, but fortuitously, I found Gautam's personal contact information through a friend and wrote him without realizing that he's also the informal keeper of the history of the docks. He knows Kitterpur docks with the detail that few others still living can possibly know it. He knows the history of buildings that no longer exist, the business aspirations of local ironmongers long since passed away, and the locations of demolished jetties. He knows Calcutta's indenture story in great detail, and the passage of laborers from the countryside through to the area known as Garden Reach. The Hooghly, which flows from the Ganges, is a tidal river, Gautam instructs. The British modeled their ports around the river to create a London of the East in Calcutta, then Calcutta with a C. The tides helping to move the swells of goods and people in and out. He walks with me onto a modern jetty and out over the water to get a view of the Howrah Bridge from the river. It's silvery gray, its characteristic shape, a silhouette behind its modern twin, the Kona Expressway, which resembles the Manhattan Bridge to me. But neither of these bridges existed in the time of indenture, when the waterway was jammed and throbbing with life. There are a few ways to think about the colonial archives, and while the book project engages with a broader, aspirational, imaginative concept of the archive, it reflects on the most literal and material aspect of the colonial archive as an administrative and curatorial edifice, and its relationship to water. Water is a device through which to engage with the changeability and viscosity of time and place, bringing time into substance and unsettling the finality of solid terrain. The archives relevant for this investigation of British colonial indentureship history are strewn throughout the world in the footprints of exploitative commerce. There are indeed colonial records in London and at the UK National Archives in the British Library and the British Library. However, many of the documents related to the correspondence between the East India Company and later incarnations of colonial administrations responsible for indentureship are found in India at the National Archives in Delhi, the State Archives of West Bengal, and to a lesser extent, the Port Authority collections in Calcutta. These records deal with the departures, returns, and large-scale policy shifts captured as records of corporate governance. This does not tend to record the quotidian and mundane, for which many indentured laborers is the evidence of their existence within the system's vast circuitry. The indentured contracts themselves, which detail the status, origins, and next of kin of the indentured, are not found at the central administrative hubs in the UK or India, or in the case of the Chinese indentured laborers in Hong Kong, but in the many countries to which the laborers went. These include Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, St. Kitts, Mauritius, Fiji, Natal, and other places in the British context. The holdings in these repositories, taken together, digitized and preserved, would allow for a more detailed overview of where the indentured laborers came from, their circumstances, their religious and social backgrounds, and their names. The materials, though, are largely not digitized and not in the best state, and despite some efforts, still in danger of being lost to decay, accidental damage, and the colonial half-life of the semi-abandoned racial capitalist project. For researchers of slavery and indenture, those critical historians and those in whose tracks I tread, the difficult work of negotiating the archives aptly described in Saidiya Hartman's trailblazing essay, Venus in Two Acts, is made more difficult given the material demands related to access. The very location of the most relevant historical records mirrors the global reach of colonial exploits and the corresponding global movement of diasporas. Despite the technological possibility of securing and making available the few and disparate records that do exist in the Jamaican context, in which the stories of the enslaved and indentured are articulated, the political economy of our age is imbricated in the same ethics and economics of the past and refuses the repair enabled through and with our stories. There are several rivers in my life I was bound to step into and across, haunted by them, compelled to them, and constituted by them as I am. The water sculpts, reflects, it carries, it holds, it destroys, and it nourishes. It disappears and reemerges elsewhere. It's inside us and it is us. It connects us to others and to ourselves. One river, the Hudson, is a river of my childhood, where my parents spent their early years, where my grandparents, some migrants from Jamaica and others migrants from the southern US states, decamped to start to lay down roots. The river basin was where I learned to skewer earthworms and chop them into pieces, confident that they would regrow, and that my menacing experiment was not cruelty. I learned lessons about the silky texture of fish insides, the sharpness of scales, the height of cliffs of Englewood where the rich people lived, and my own proximity to drowning. The water was murky and notoriously dirty and fast. There's a second river, the Petey, by which my father's family left, with thousands of others during the Great Migration to the north. They were not escaping from the water exactly, although the basin collected all the blood they managed to give the land they tilled. They were escaping by way of the water. The Petey, on the northern edge of South Carolina, was the watershed for the Pegasus Place House, the plantation that gave my great-great-grandmother her name. French Huguenots fleeing persecution ran a stable business with hundreds of enslaved Africans, and immediately after emancipation, my great-grandparents escaped quickly towards the Hudson Basin. The third river, the Rio Minho, is the river in Clarendon, Jamaica that fed the sugar estate where my mother's family, indentured East Indians, cut cane for 3 generations. The heat and reliable rain made the soil fertile enough to support the dense cane crop, which was best harvested by machete or cutlass. The youngest of the final generation of cutters, the namesake of his older brother, fled, reconstituted himself, and fled again, changing state like rain and landing with so many others on the Hudson. The Ganges is the fourth river where I'd eventually sit with Gautam in the silence of an ossified port. For my ancestors, there was a direction of flow, the Ganges first, then the Rio Minho, and so on. For me, the rivers are all contemporaries. Time is a different proposition for those of us stranded, planted in the diaspora. Water, and more precisely the tidal flows of rivers and oceans that are choreographed by the pull of gravity and in turn direct our movement. The metamorphosis of precipitation, dark depths that resist knowing but nonetheless sustain life, can be imagined as a theoretical device. Its life-giving dynamism mirrors the life cycles of all Earth's beings, and in particular ways, this applies to those processed through the machinery of colonial commerce and transport, even to the extent that death can be treated not as an afterlife, but rather as a temporal stage in a bigger arc of movement, a state of being. The concept of the Kalapani, or dark water, literally black water, referring to the Hindu belief that crossing the seas potentially eviscerates one's ties to spiritual, cultural, and social life in India. In the way that it's remembered in the context of South Asian descendants of indentured laborers, hints towards the unknowability of the depths, the immediate danger in breaking with known societies and surrendering to unknown ones. The image conjures a dark, perilous plain, a turbulent route that is meant to change the person who crosses it into someone different, someone whose connections are maimed by the deliberately stepping out into the water and who's no longer recognizable by their kin, as though history will not able to serve as a container for them. In some ways, the water generally, and Kalapani in particular, have been used as frames not only for describing the physics of the indentureship journeys, but their metaphysics, of the ability to engage historically with the liminal ebb and flow of the dead, to grapple with the existence of life beyond the shallows of historical record, and though tethered, to imagine ourselves into the abyss. After the abolition of slavery in the British colonial territories in 1933, The government, prompted by Sir John Gladstone, in the interest of colonial enterprise across a range of territories, looked to South Asia for manual labor resources, primarily in agricultural production, but also in the means of facilitating that production. While captive labor had been outlawed, and this was portrayed as a victorious triumph of the colonial empire, indentureship was formally presented as a voluntary system, not a system of carcerality. It was rather framed as contracted labor in which the outgoing voyage to various colonies would be recorded as a debt against which travelers, the would-be laborers, would need to work for a total of 5 years in order to pay off. Typically, under these indentures, a worker would be free from the labor relationship with a particular plantation after 5 years, but if they extended the indenture another 5 years to serve a total of 10, they would have earned a return trip. It's important to note that Gladstone himself had owned thousands of slaves during the slave system and was a huge agriculturalist in the Caribbean. And upon emancipation, he was paid out compensation by the British government of 84,000 pounds in 1830s money, which would have been around 7 million today. And the British government paid around 40% of the year's budget compensating former slave owners for lost labor in the amount of 20 billion in today's money, which makes it the biggest bailout in the UK's history. It's also important to note that Gladstone alone was not the sole force in compelling the indentureship system forward. It's not that his emphasis is unearned, but there are a range of incentives that push forward the system, including broader economic interests facing British agricultural producers across the colonies and the related governmental interests to keep the economy moving. Lisa Lowe also reminds us that there were attempts in 1807 to bring Chinese workers to Trinidad, along with the East India Company goods, after the trade in human enslavement had ended in 1807, which was separate from the possession of slaves, which came in the 30s. It was just about the trade. And it was hoped that this Trinidad experiment would supplant the labor force that enslavement had sustained. The British indentureship story is also not the only story of indenture. Not only did the French and Dutch establish analogous systems of indentureship in India during the same period, other populations were historically subjected to forms of debt bondage that can be broadly understood as indentured labor, including white indentured laborers who were brought to the United States. But during this period, thousands were also sent to the Reunion Islands, to Martinique and Guadeloupe, to Suriname, and to French Guyana. It's important to note that Jamaica is not an area of too much focus in the larger terrain of indentureship research. My talk touches on Jamaica, and the book project is much more committed to understanding the specificity of indentureship to the island. But Jamaica received a relatively small number of indentured workers, and that created a different set of political and social issues than in Trinidad or Guyana, which received comparatively far more. The voyage to the colonies was in large ships, some of them repurposed slave ships, where dysentery was rampant in the first few decades of the indentureship period. Many died on the ships. When they arrived in Jamaica, they were placed in plantations and housed in barracks on the estates, in detached huts, or in long rows with poor sanitation. And of course, there was physical abuse by the overseers who managed the plantation labor. The labor consisted of mainly manual agricultural labor, and in Jamaica, much of the labor was the manual harvesting of sugarcane or working on banana plantations. This physically arduous work, which was done with a machete or a cutlass, it was sugarcane that was harvested and brought to the mill for processing afterwards. The lifespan of the laborers was quite short. The first Indians arrived in Jamaica on indentured contracts in 1845, and for the duration of the indentured period, which lasted formally until about 1917, around 85% of the Indians arrived from what is now Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, and Bihar in the north via Calcutta. Many spoke Bhojpuri, and the remaining 15% or so arrived via Madras from southern India. So the indentureship system had some governing or disciplining effect in virtually every sphere of the lives of indentured laborers. While the system was presented in its most innocuous depictions as consensual, contracted work that was undertaken voluntarily, even that's not accurate, as many laborers were not privy to the full scope of the system and couldn't read the documents they were signing anyway. And indentureship was not merely a system of labor, it was an entire form of governance in relation to a certain immigrant class of colonial subject in the colonies, including their children. Of course, in modern times, there are populations around the world who did not enjoy the protections of modern citizenship or are otherwise precarious in terms of protections offered to them by the state and not guaranteed under international law. And these populations are vulnerable to extensive labor exploitation today in the US, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. Part of what I intend to explore going forward, aside from ways to think about history generally, through narrative and through literature, is to think of the ways that the lives of the workers were shaped by the system of indenture and to add to the important historical foundations established by historians like Vereen Shepherd and others. Important in this regard, these contracts were not only labor contracts, but they had implications on family law, immigration law, and criminal law. For example, if a laborer skipped work, he or she was fined and sometimes jailed. The laws, policies, and institutional practices formed the basis of state regulation of the lives and relationships and religious identities and family structures of the indentured, aside, obviously, from their employment. I'll mention a few areas just to give you a sense of what I mean. Penalties for unlawful absence from work were pretty harsh, and refusal to work could result in a fine of £3, which was a lot, and 2 months in prison. Because laborers were often imprisoned, it indicates that they didn't have the money to pay these fines. The Indians were meant to remain within the confines of the estates that they labored on. There were laws put in place to reduce clashes with English legal customs, and these had an impact on the areas of life typically governed by family law in Jamaica. These were parallel laws applicable to the indentured Indians as immigrant classes. In 1896, the Immigrants' Marriage, Divorce, and Succession Law was passed, and this set a minimum age for marriage of 13 for women and 15 for men in an attempt to accommodate Indian cultural practices, but then increased the age to 16 a few decades later. The Law 22 of 1896 recognized marriages done according to Muslim and Hindu rites, although according to Shepherd's analysis, it actually made the process of recognition extremely difficult because it required couples to provide a certificate of no impediment to prevent polygamy or interfamily marriage. It had to be issued within 3 months of the marriage and solemnized within 2 days. Indians who converted to Christianity would no longer be governed by the special 1896 law technically, but they'd still need to present this onerous certificate of no impediment. Also, to register marriages, Indians in rural areas needed to travel to Kingston to the Office of the Protector of Immigrants with the religious officiator and with a witness literate in English who would write the marriage document, and they had to do this within 7 days. Failure to do this meant the marriage was not legal, and that impacted the ability for children of the marriage to inherit land. Shepherd also mentions an example of assimilation in everyday life, helping to make life easier with regard to these laws. For those Indians who converted to Christianity, religious officiators of the marriages could, based on the names and appearances of applicants, use their discretion to decide to waive the requirement of this certificate of no impediment. She gives the example of a reverend in the parish of St. Thomas deciding that Egbert Eshu and Marion Roberts were not Indian names and that Marion Roberts looked like an African woman of mixed heritage. So performance and names were important features in determining the ease of major life decisions. And bit by bit, in my view, this translates into shaping the character and identity of a people and how they negotiate the system of laws. There was surely an incentive to change one's name in relation to marriage. There were also issues with cremation. The law was unclear as to whether cremation was permissible, and this was clarified in the mid-20th century following pressure from groups in India. But no cremation facilities were available in Jamaica until 1950. The education system was also governed by a mixture of formal laws and interests from various parties, and the economic and social needs of indentured laborers, as well as those indentured, whose indentures had expired, meant that very few children attended elementary schools. The general government policy was that children in Jamaica should attend common schools, whereas the Indians regarded that prospect as de-Indianization. This view was also riddled with prejudice against African Jamaicans, which is highly problematic, but is also based on a rejection of the strong Christian religious teachings that were central to the curriculum in elementary schools, the exclusively English language teaching, a lack of Indian teachers, and perhaps most importantly, many Indian families desperately relied on the earnings of their children. The demand for special schools for Indian children was not considered by the government, and through the 1950s, the illiteracy rate of Indians in Jamaica remained among the highest of any group in the high 40%. Missionaries were not very interested in converting the Indians in Jamaica until the 1890s because they'd been focused on the Afro-Jamaicans. But when, according to Shepard, their numbers in Jamaica increased around that time to such an extent that the missionaries became worried that religious and cultural norms of the Indians would impede their ability to continue to influence Afro-Jamaicans, they changed. So they began to support religious schooling for Indians and to engage more directly with them in their missionary work. It's important to notice the various interests that developed around the scaffolding of legal provisions governing Indian life. The commercial planters had no interest in seeing Indian children be educated, and they also had a vested interest in having Indians extend their periods of indenture. In Jamaica, one way in which this interest was supported by law was a provision that made Indians pay part of the return journey, which sharply decreased the number of people who opted to return than to remain in some form of agricultural labor in Jamaica. There was the interest of the state in both keeping planters happy, since they provided a major source of revenue for the empire, but also maintaining at least the appearance of a moral legitimacy of the indentureship system. And where the aims of the religious, and then there were the aims of the religious missions, which in principle had a civilizing project in place. And the colonial administration also had a cultural integration mission, which clashed with the wishes of the Indians. So I now want to move on to talk a little bit about death and the concept of death and how it features into how I read through the archive. Death occupies a central place in the archive of indenture. Mortality rates on ships and plantations, inquests commissioned to examine mysterious deaths, significant accidents, mistakes, murders, and suicides all comprise the vernacular of the indenture's textual archive. It's a language of reporting to the governing authorities. It's the grammar of economic accountability at the margins of plantation profits and losses. And it's through this language that the events of the laborers' lives are staged in the archive. The code is apparent when one reads through the reports in the archive, and it reveals that the most significant measures of the laborers' lives in the colonial ledgers are the ways that they died. Rates of mortality were a central aspect of the complex moral, political, and financial economy of the indentureship system. However, the figures only allude to the stories that underlie these deaths, since the dead do not speak with words. Their experiences must be read from the larger context within which the numbers are situated. This requires not only sociological inquiry, but careful intuition and, above all, imagination. Being open to and aware of the everyday lives of the indentured helps us to view those circumstances that kept indentured laborers perpetually and intimately adjacent to death. In legal or political science terms, this type of subordination can be understood as state violence, inasmuch as the social position that's created and imposed with active participation of state institutions. This violence impacted indentured laborers not only physically, but mentally and psychically. In the years 1856 and 1857, considerable numbers of South Asian people who were indentured to work in the Caribbean died aboard several ships that sailed from Calcutta to the West Indies. Among the ships were the Wellesley, the Evelyn, the Bucephalus, the Sir Robert Seppings, and the Roman Emperor. On the Wellesley, 22 of the 382 people on board died before the ship reached its destination of Demerara. the Bucephalus carrying 389 people, of which 45 died between Calcutta and Georgetown, Guyana. The Sir Robert Seppings lost 61 people out of 291. The Roman Emperor lost 88 out of 313 voyagers, or 28%. The report spans over a dozen pages and enumerates the weekly death toll on several of the ships. The report is an inquiry into the deaths, and it weighs up concerns reported both from the emigration offices in Calcutta and in Demerara in an attempt to identify the causes of the dysentery that killed so many of those on board the ships. The reasons discussed in the investigation tend to focus on pre-existing sickness and the unsanitary health habits of Indians, which was thought to have been exacerbated by poor management or care by the emigration offices. Some of the analysis in the report also focuses on a lack of certain specific medical devices aboard the ships. However, like many of these types of administrative records, certain central presuppositions are kept in place: the movement of the indenture system towards a more humane one, and the relative unimportance of single stories or the qualitative aspects of those scores of deaths. The deaths are discussed as a symptom of a systems error, and that with the right input into the system, it would be capable of producing a circuit of cheap labor sustainably and without death. There are patterns in the logic presented in the reporting of deaths of indentured laborers that tends to minimize the role of the state and the corporate institutions and accentuate the narrative of tragic predestination of South Asians to self-annihilate. This is foreseeable given the interests at stake, but worthy of reflection since these records are such a considerable part of the formal archive. The narrative etched amidst the reports and administrative records is deployed to service the legitimacy of the colonial government in administering the indentureship system, despite the very bad reception of the early 1830s trial of the system, which was made by a committee appointed on the indentureship of, quote, coolies, which resulted in its temporary abolition. In describing some deaths, the documents focus on the imputed incapacity, infirmity, debility, and self-destructive behavior of South Asian indentured people. Focusing on the behavior rather than the totality of the circumstances in which they find themselves involves the concurrent and interdependent deployment of discourses of culture, gender, religion, and estrangement in order to provide a rationale for the commonplace of death. Not so incidentally, there are thematic continuities that allow us to understand the colonial capital logics involved in the indentureship system in relation to contemporary forms of carcerality, including policing, incarceration, and institutionalization, at the intersection of race and mental health, particularly if we're to understand carcerality, as late Ben Moshe has written, as a form of racial capitalism. There were a large number of suicides reported to have occurred in Mauritius. The causes of death are listed in the administrative record according to categories of personal strife and mental or cultural affliction, without much reference at all to the context of indenture, which was a system of near total control of the workers, regulated by all the forms of law I've described, which underpin arbitrary violence and social exclusion. The categories are listed as jealousy, revenge, sickness, temporary insanity, and homesickness, among others. The category of discontent and ill treatment was very low in numbers of deaths recorded against it. Even in their allusions to the desperate environment constituted by the indentureship period, where the work of cutting cane truncated the lifespan of its workers by decades, the categories place moral culpability with the indentured, implying that they were internally compelled to such a fate, unable to control their impulses, emotions, or cultural proclivities. In certain ways, we can understand these categories as arbitrary, blending out the interwoven aspects of systemic impoverishment, calculated physical and mental strain, and uncertain future prospects. There's also the story, like the story of Madhuri, who returned to Calcutta after having suffered mentally and in a state where she needed constant support. In fact, she could not produce evidence of where she'd come from in Jamaica or what estate she was living on. And that meant that at first, the colonial administration and the government of West Bengal would not take her back into care or care for her, albeit that care was in the form of institutionalization, which is another story. But she was eventually granted support, and it would be demanded that the Jamaican authorities fund it. But the issue was a question of being able to deduce the impact of the conditions of indentureship, the physical and mental stresses it put upon masses of people. In this one woman's case of return, that was promised to her as a condition of her labor. But it also recalls that eventually those who are ill or incapable of caring for themselves would be denied a return trip from Jamaica or from Guyana. And this is a part of the continuity of this form of social exclusion and lack of protection. In a different record, a similar thing occurs. The document is a register of all those South Asians who died on one of the return voyages back to Calcutta from Guyana. And notable for our purposes is that while many died from diarrhea or dysentery, some of them had remarks against them in the ledgers that included recreational drug use, such as ganja smoking and opium eating. From the perspective of maintaining the legitimacy of the indenture system, including the well-being of those on return transport, this is interesting. The indenture system had been under scrutiny from the beginning because it was launched to fill the labor void left for planters with the abolition of slavery. But the conditions of transporting and caring for people on the journey had quite high mortality rates in the initial decades of the system. The 1960s marked a turning point in various policies regarding the care of immigrants. The recording of pre-existing conditions or behavior patterns on the remarks alleviates some of the responsibility from the transporters for mortality. Weed smoking and opium addiction may have had some relation to health, but being that dysentery was the common illness on these voyages, it seems of relatively little relevance, but for the ability to catalog, classify, and distinguish what would potentially be construed as a liability. It would be interesting to understand how these registers and medical remarks were evaluated in the colony. Drug use, particularly alcoholism, was understood to be high among the indentured, so it was not unimportant that ganja and opium, associated with India and China respectively, rather than with the Jamaican colonial outpost, are mentioned here in this time period as health concerns. One might ask how the nature of these activities is placed outside of the context of the indenture and understood as an affliction of laborers' origins, haunting their ability to ever adjust, making some loss of life inevitable. This contrasts with the material reality that opium was a product of global trade, and more to the point, that the British were responsible for forcing it illegally into the market of China and producing it in India, among other places, which ultimately led to opium wars, or that rum production was a principal product of cutting sugarcane in the Caribbean, and that many of the indentured workers would have been working on the same premises as the rum distilleries. This recalls the incredible work of Lisa Lowe in her book, The Intimacies of Four Continents, where she unpacks the integrated colonial system in exploring ideas of liberalism and the connectedness of the opium trade, colonial systems of exploitation, and our approach to history more generally. Of course, we can't rely on the documents for recording business interests of planners and the legitimacy interests of the colonial administration of the indentureship system to tell us the stories of the interior, intimate lives of those who were indentured to agricultural labor. So in a sense, one might ask why it even bears discussion. Why interrogate what we know will produce a language of relative dehumanization? In a way, it's an attempt to do what Hartman is doing in Venus in Two Acts, by devising a way to tell the story, in her case, of a Black woman who only appeared twice in the record of ship's voyages. And when she did, it was framed in a dismissive and violent and dehumanizing manner of a slur. Even her absence in that text gives us information. It's also what Vereen Shepherd does in Maharani's Misery, when she grapples with the story of a woman who was sexually abused and died aboard the ship, the Allenshaw, which was carrying indentured laborers to Guyana in the 1800s. It's perhaps an attempt to do what Tara Yoso does in the tradition of Derek Bell in what he calls critical race counter stories, to reimagine or re-narrate the stories, the terms of the stories, with the information available, but to do this by reaching outside of the frame of the official legal narrative, and more importantly, outside the implied ideological frame. This ideological frame might assume that the Mexican, African, and Indian people, respectively, in the examples I've used, in the context of the historical record, can no longer be imagined to have inhabited a broader context, and that than a flat objectification of these dusty archives, or comprehend a range of choices or at least textures of life and circumstances, or to be capable of vision or knowledge creation. It's an experiment in historical inquiry, but it's a necessary one. There's a different type of death I'd like to end with, and that's the death of Ali Bhaktas, who was my great-grandfather. Ali was born on Sevens plantations in Maypen, Clarendon, where both his parents were also laborers. His parents, Sudoa and Karamia, had likely been born in northern India, having arrived to work cutting cane on Sevens plantation with dozens of other East Indians, large groups of whom had intermarried, resulting in a multiply connected set of families. He met his wife on the plantation, Adela of the Reed family, likely formerly Rahid, was something completely different, and the Rami family. She told my aunt that her parents had come over from East Pakistan, the old name for Bangladesh, but this is also disputed. The stories of our lineage, as contested as they are, live together, and though they sometimes quarrel, they mostly talk in turn and give us as many possible worlds to enter as we can imagine. What is clear, though, and recorded, is that Ali Bhaktas died in 1957, and Samuel Bruce emerged in his place. Ali changed his name through deed poll, as required by law, carried out in Kingston prior to Ali or Samuel's departure to the United States. The poll declares Ali Bhaktas late, which is an apt turn of phrase for the extinguishing of one set of life ways for another. Late in this sense means devoid of life. But of course, it's not linear time we're talking about. He's not late to himself. His own life and the extinction of his former name and the heritage that that held was left as a relic in the archive and not discussed by our family either. This precipitated a new set of possibilities, and with it, a new set of foreclosures. And this is a photo of Maypen's 7 plantations. And it was taken a year after Ali's birth. So he's there somewhere sharing the space with the workers cutting and carrying sugarcane, one of which may very well be his father, Sudoa. Ali had been using the name Samuel Bruce well before he officially changed it in 1957. He listed that name on his marriage certificate in 1925. He also listed it on his children's birth certificates in the 20s and 30s. Most likely, in order to get the children registered for schools, and in order to distance himself and his children from the generations spent on Sevens Plantation, where Adela's parents were also born. He changed his name in the late 1950s in order to function more officially as Samuel Bruce, perhaps in preparation for his flight to the US. His sons and daughters had already gone ahead, adults starting their own families, Bruce's from birth. Samuel died in the 80s, a Presbyterian minister, likely having been influenced to serve the same institution that inspired the name he would go on to call himself for the majority of his life. The Scottish Presbyterian mission was very active in Jamaica in his youth, and a very important aspect of the moral crusade underwritten by the governance of empire. I'm going to leave my talk there. Thanks to my cousins and fellow genealogists, Xavier Moss and Michael Anthony, for their work on our family stories, which gave a lot to my own research. And also thanks to contemporary collaborators Tao Lee Goff, Gayusha Bahadur, Maria Kaladin, and Rajiv Mohabir for your own inspiring work and intellectual community. Thank you. Oh, I think you're muted.
I thought I unmuted myself. Thank you so much, Dr. Bruce Jones. It was really lovely. Thank you for taking us down that trip with your talk. It was really fantastic. I'm going to serve as a moderator. I'm going to call on people who have their hands up, but I'm looking at the participants. I'm sorry, I'm trying to pull them up right now. And I see that David Sipe has a question. Professor Sipe?
Muted now. Can you hear me now? I am trying to speak. I don't see that I'm muted. Okay. Thank you for acknowledging. This was a fascinating introduction to a world I had no idea about, this indentureship system. I think people who study law in America are far too blinkered about the rest of the world having anything to do with us. But I know from some historical study that our American British colonies, our law of slavery was something that was taken over from the British possessions in the West Indies, in the Caribbean. This talk of yours reminds me very strongly of the post-emancipation, the post-1865 Southern states, which now had no institution of slavery, and turned to freedmen's contracts. Contracts with the remaining population who didn't try to get away from those plantations as soon as they could, but were very one-sided contracts supervised by the Freedmen's Bureau, but also from the white now employers of persons. I don't want to give you an entirely new archive to look at, God forbid, but the Freedmen's Bureau, Freedmen contracts and the indentureship and apprenticeship contracts that supplement them are a world that I think could be very easily compared. The suggestion would be that the Southern states now rejoined to the Union after the Civil War would look to British possessions, again, in the Caribbean and northern part of South America, for examples of what to do in a post-slavery situation. And if you could find some of these contracts or the laws surrounding these contracts that were very, very similar, that would be a lovely way to connect some of us with this system. Let me just suggest that when we see indentureship, it is in the context of young persons, apprenticeship / indentureship, that it doesn't come with the adult population so much. Those are called labor contracts. And the adult population that the Southern states would be dealing with would be equally male and female in pretty much equal numbers. And so I wonder if you could talk about whether they'd be adapting a system that was primarily dealing with adult males and very few females to the system that they'd have in the Reconstruction South. That would be my question.
No, that's a really great point. And the comparison with other forms of indenture, and particularly with post-1865 freedmen's contracts, is really clear. And for me, I want to engage in that comparison. I think I've just been a bit careful about making the comparison too early in my work, because this will be my first major work on this topic, and it is a fraught comparison to make, because there's already a whole line of I think there's a line of thinking about this, that if we make the comparison to the slave system, particularly slavery that was ongoing during the indentureship period in the U.S., that it raises lots of alarm bells about whether the comparison is actually reading too much into the engagement between the two systems, or between the British and the American forms of rule. That being said, I think there is a big piece of research there on looking at kind of the discussions, the political discussions, looking at this mirroring in some way that goes beyond that. So I think I have to prepare myself for something like that in the future, but I think it's a really great idea. And in terms of the indentureship, the gender breakdown in the indentureship system, it was predominantly men that were sent across in the beginning, many decades of the system. And then eventually there was a quota put in place to increase the number of women that were being brought over, partly because there's one narrative that, you know, men weren't able to then create community in the same way, and it was causing lots of problems, and it was causing violence and sadness and suicide. So that's one kind of narrative. And the other is more of the economic kind of rationale for having bigger populations of labor that was basically open to exploitation. So midway through the system, there were quotas put in place for more women to be brought over, but it was never quite 50-50. And I think it was planned to be quite male, you know, centered on men for the first few decades of it. But thank you for your comments. That's really, really helpful for me.
Thank you.
Dr. Bruce Jones, I have a question in the chat from all the way from Griffith College in Dublin, the Republic of Ireland. It says, thanks for this intriguing lecture. Also, thanks to you for arranging this. 2 questions. To what extent were the pre-existing markets for human trafficking, excuse my butchering of these words, Dikara, Kangani, and Maestra, helpful in elaboration of indentured labor in your case study? And how did post-colonial Jamaica engage and accommodate the new identities?
Well, I mean, in terms of how indentures been constructed in the archive, it hasn't been necessarily one that's used the terminology of, I mean, it's been seen as being corrupt, it's been seen as being coercive, it's been within the time period. So in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, people were writing about it as a system that was riddled with corruption and coercion. And so there's a lot to be, there are connections to be made between what you're naming there, Tamil, the pre-existing kind of systems of human trafficking. But I think it also, I mean, all of this is playing out in a very legislative way. So it's very transparent to see what the interests are in terms of the economic interest, and then what's being kind of intimated to agents who are being subcontracted to go out and find people to then join the system. The traffic, like the idea of trafficking though, and maybe we can talk offline more about kind of the intricacies of those other systems, might be a little bit more difficult to relate directly to a different system. There were a lot of parties involved with getting people to actually join up and sign, but at any given stage, there could have been coercion. And so I guess how we define it and whether we think of that as trafficking or not, I think there's a good argument for doing so, but I think we might lose something in the way that the corporate structures allowed this to still have legitimacy in terms of conveying to people that this was an above board voluntary system, and something that's seen as more of an underground black market in trading people. So that's just something. And then the, how did post-colonial Jamaica engage and accommodate new identities? I feel like, I guess on one hand, I wanna say identity per se isn't the only way that I'm looking at this. And I think I don't have the expertise to look at diasporic identity in its fullness because I'm not a Caribbean scholar. And I think for me, I'm trying to locate how people were able to navigate this system, what violence it visited upon them, how it affected their interior lives. And to that extent, I mean, from the research that I've been doing and from the people I've spoken to and the family and people I've been able to interview, I mean, it did set up a system where people needed to conform in order to survive. It set up a system where there was a lot of racial animosity that was played up by this colonial indentureship system, and not, it didn't try to remedy the rifts in kind of, it was kind of a divide and rule type of situation where you have these different labor forces that are put against one another. In terms of the Afro-Jamaicans and Indo-Jamaicans. And so identity, but that being said, many authors have written about how because of the small number of Indian indentured workers who were in Jamaica, there was less of a, there was on one hand a lot less of a community, in the sense that there's of course the retention of practices and language to some extent, but not to the extent that there was in Guyana and Trinidad, where there are a lot more people and a critical mass of people, and being able to have these cultural forms persist just wasn't the case in Jamaica. So there was a lot more of, you know, of mixing of different communities, and there was a lot more pressure to then assimilate and to speak English, to change your name, to convert to Christianity. So that's why you kind of notice that difference in the way that identity is constructed or experienced or lived in Jamaica as different, perhaps, from Guyana and Trinidad, with tons of qualifiers there. But that's kind of, if there's anything specific to say about Jamaica, I think that's one of the things that's always coming out in the literature.
So we have a question from Rajiv Mohabir. She says, thank you so much for this heartbreaking and illuminating talk. I'm struck by how much of your own personal history causes you as a researcher to hold these histories in a way not common to the white Bakra, in parentheses, institution. I was wondering if you could speak a little about any personal surprises, joys for you when you were researching and marrying your family stories to this study.
Oh, thank you, Rajiv, for that question. Yeah, there have been many. I think it's, you know, part of this is a journey through my own family history research, which involves, you know, like I mentioned, these different rivers, these different places, South Carolina, Jamaica, India. I recently got to go to Elmina Castle in Ghana. I mean, and so some of this is a history and like a broad sense of history, and some of it is looking at documents about people I know and, you know, people's parents who I know. And all of that, I think, came together for me around some central questions, which are, you know, A, because of exploitation, whether it's through colonial exploitation in the form of slavery or indentureship, a lot of the records about the details of our ancestors are missing or destroyed or gone, or they weren't produced, despite the movement that required them to then be transported to another place. So it makes it difficult to then keep track of these histories, and that was kind of a calling for me to do. But then another is kind of an intellectual interest, because like you said, I think the institutions that we are a part of, and that might be, you know, any given, how funding is distributed, let's say in the UK where I am, around things that you can prove an impact to, but then being able to articulate, you know, the need for these documents to be preserved and for this history to be told as an impact, I've been finding quite difficult. There are ways that I think these institutions don't see the urgency around preserving this type of history and to theorizing these types of narratives, I think is always going to be an uphill battle because of the need to secure some sort of impact on it. So this kind of hit me when there's a brilliant project in the UK called the Legacies of British Slavery, where Catherine Hall is mapping the money, basically mapping the payouts to British slaveholders who then lost their labor, right, through the abolition of slavery. And then all that money that was paid out to these slaveholders then got either invested or it got, you know, it got put somewhere, and tracing this money even throughout London. So she does a good job of like looking at where the money went and what it invested into, so what it enabled, was a project that I think is really worthwhile. I also, though, think that projects like the recovery of the strands of the historical archive that we can see, but we can't gather together because they're not the resources or the political instruments to do so. Those are also important, and they're finite. I mean, people are passing away, so the stories might be passing away in some sense. Of course, they're passed on, but sometimes they're not. The archives that aren't digitized or are kept without copies are a finite resource. So that's all been a big part of this research. And I guess the joy, aside from being able to kind of tell these stories in more resolution, which makes me feel personally fulfilled, is having a community of people who are looking at the legacies of enslavement of Africans and the legacy of the indenture of Indians, who are concerned with these questions and who are finding new ways to think about them. So like Ali Bhaktas' work on the visual nature of some of these stories, I think those types of approaches interest me, and I'm just fascinated and happy to be in community with people doing this work.
All right, so I want to say if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A. And then I also want to say it's really wonderful. We have the Zoom is really great because we have this wonderful global audience. And I want to, our next question comes from Angela Ramsundur from Mauritius. She says there is a Center for the Study of Slavery and Indenture at the University of Mauritius. Mm-hmm. And there's also the, I can't pronounce this, Apravasi Ghat World Heritage Site, which is a former immigration depot built in 1849 for indentured labor from India, now an interpretation center. And so she just wanted to note that. And she leaves her email address, which we should give to you.
Great, thank you, Angela. That's wonderful, and it's great to hear from someone in Mauritius. I have some colleagues who are doing work in Mauritius that that hopefully will know about this center and hopefully are using. So thank you so much. It'd be great to be able to make it to Mauritius one day.
So I have a question from Anupam Roy, who says that was a similar indenture system used to get Africans to Jamaica?
So there was a system of free immigrant labor after the abolition of the enslavement of African people. And so during that time period, there are also people who were emigrating from different parts of Africa, for example, from Sierra Leone. But it wasn't on this indentured basis as far as I know. I could be mistaken, but they were basically brought as free laborers. And Vereen Shepherd writes about how different communities and different systems of labor in Jamaica overlapped. I mean, she's the pivotal historian on labor and the plantation economies in Jamaica.
So we have a question from Dr. Anjali Singh. Says, thank you for such an engaging lecture. My question is whether there is literature available, even first-person narratives that have been written by descendants of indentured Indians in Jamaica.
I'm not sure about Jamaica, because I know there are first-person accounts written. For example, in the context in Guyana, Rajiv, who asked the question before, actually wrote, translated and kind of wrote on some poems that were written by someone who's indentured in Guyana, and it's beautiful. I thought I had it. But in the Jamaican context, I'm not sure. I mean, there have been oral histories and interviews with people, but I'm not sure about written accounts of people who were actually indentured, partly because they would be quite old, and if they wrote those accounts during indenture, though, maybe they've been retained or something, but I don't know of any. But I also could be wrong about that. If we can stay in touch, maybe we can try to figure it out.
So it's Dr. Anjali Singh. There's no email, but let's see. So I'm going to read. There are two professors at BU who've written questions, Daniela Caruso and Gary Lawson. And because we have 5 minutes, I'll read both of them and you can respond however. And so Daniela says, thanks for sharing with us your fascinating research. In the UK, what is the current state of the debate on restitution? As research makes clear that the logic of contract does not justify past transfers of wealth on a performance of labor, does it become possible to leverage the notion of unjust enrichment as a natural corrective within the UK legal system. Did you hear me?
Yeah, so
Do you want me to read the next question, or do you want me to?
I have that question. I'll go back and reread them as I answer. Okay, if you could read the next question, that'd be great.
Yeah, the next question is from Gary Lawson. Professor Gary Lawson says, do we know what kinds of verbal representations were made in India about the terms of the contracts on the assumption that people would not understand what they were signing? Were conditions in India so bad that people just assumed that anything had to be better than what they had?
Maybe I'll just answer Professor Lawson's first. That really varied. What people were told really varied. And there were reports that were written in the early decades of the system that indicated that people were being told one thing, like that they would be able to come back very easily, or they were told they were going to a certain place that wasn't very far. Meanwhile, they were going to the Caribbean, and they couldn't read. So it was, really relying on what people were telling them. And so that's one thing. So the assumption is that many people were probably told something that was a misrepresentation of what was going to happen. And sometimes it wasn't even clear where they were going until they got to the depot and had to sign up. But then in terms of what they were leaving, many people left because they were looking for some form of, economic opportunity, maybe because, some left because they were destitute, some left having recalled that, they were either socially marginalized because of who they were with or who they married, or for some other reason. Some people left who were in the higher castes, who also had some sort of social reason that allowed them to leave or kind of pushed them to go. But it wasn't always because that people had nothing. It was mainly laborers who were manual laborers who were experiencing a bad time, who were contracted to go from the north. But yeah, so most people were unable to read, and they had to rely on the verbal representations of the subcontracted agents. And this was flagged as a corrupt practice, but still, in the early decades of indenture. But it's unclear as to how much this was followed up throughout the middle period of the indentureship system to kind of locate where the misrepresentation was actually coming from, or whether it was still there was still misrepresentation. And Professor Caruso's question, his research makes it clear the logic of contract does not justify past transfers of wealth, performance of labor. Does it make it possible to leverage the notion of unjust enrichment as a natural corrective? So I guess the question is whether unjust enrichment can be a way to so I mean, I guess this is a general question about the idea of having to pay off a debt with some of the wages that you're earning. I'm not sure. I mean, so in terms of thinking about reparations and restitution, there are probably many ways to kind of assign what the figure would be, because I think even with reparations, thinking about money, reparations in terms of payment against a contract for enslavement, I guess there are different ways to think about what that figure would be. And unjust enrichment, I suppose, I guess we'd have to think about what the contract was and what the unjust enrichment was, because in some ways, like, it's hard to externalize the costs that were that actually led to the enrichment of all of these planters, who basically, so they repurposed slave ships. They basically sent people on really hazardous journeys. They subjected them to physical violence and basically torture. I mean, it's, in some ways, there's, I would think of it as almost an unconscionable type of contractual relationship. I'm not quite sure. I guess I have to think about how we could use unjust enrichment in a way where the numbers would make sense. Because of course the wages were very low, and as one of the questions pointed out, it's not debt bondage, as Radhika Mongia points out in one of her questions that she was going to ask. They were paid a wage, and this was kind of seen as a part of the logic that this was a legitimate system. But it was still an exploitative wage, an exploitative system, and the whole machinery of the system relied on, the planter economy was one of the biggest economies in the British Empire. So it was upholding the sugar empire, but these people were really earning at the end of the day, after fines were paid, whatever else, they were earning very little. So I don't know if unjust enrichment would be enough to try to figure out how to deal with this in the UK system, but I think it's a start. But I'm not really faithful in contract law to save, to make the claim on behalf of the reparations debate, because I think that debate would have to take into account the structural features of how the economy's benefited from it. So maybe unjust enrichment plus, some structural idea of beyond the contract, how the empire relied on this form of exploitation to survive for those 82 years.
So we are at 2:00, which is time, but there are some more questions in the audience. You attracted a global audience, including somebody from York University. Next question is from somebody from York University in Toronto and University of West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. Some more BU faculty, and of course, someone from a Birkbeck alumnus in London, which is, I'm sure. So I'm not sure how we want to handle this. I think that we're saving these questions for you so that you can respond. If people wanted to type in their email addresses, I believe that Dr. Bruce Jones can respond through email as well, the people who ask questions.
Great. Yeah, I'm happy to respond to questions offline. Professor Mongia, I see. Professor Bierman, great. I'm happy to respond offline. Excellent.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bruce Jones, for a fantastic lecture. You generated a great discussion and a lot of questions. And thank you for answering questions and over email afterwards. We appreciate it. And thank you all for coming to this lecture. We appreciate your joining our discussion from near and from far. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.